Absolutely, yes, and I have been a leading advocate against Sharia law. Sharia law has no business in our courts, as I mentioned before, when it comes to defending sovereignty. A critical part of keeping foreign law, and Sharia is religious Islamic law, and it has no business in the United States in any court of law whatsoever, and that's been something that I've been leading the fight on for many, many years, and that's a point worth underscoring. You see people who take positions in a political campaign that may be popular at the moment. My perspective as a voter is I'm far less interested in what a candidate says on the campaign trail. It's not difficult for a candidate on the campaign trail to say whatever is popular at the moment. What I'm interested in is that they walk the walk. As Scripture says, you shall know them by their fruits. And when it comes to standing up against Sharia law, I have been leading that fight for many, many years. And to the best of my knowledge, there is nobody else on that Republican debate stage that has been leading the fight or has been confronting Sharia law the way that I have.
Okay, Senator, how's your time looking? We've got a lot of other questions. How many more you think we can take?
I think I've got about another 10 minutes.
Okay, great. Bill, let's go to the next question. If folks keep your questions to the point, and we can get in several more.
Folks, I'm just going to announce the last four numbers in your phone number, and then please identify yourself and ask your question. Phone number 4439. Go ahead.
Yes, this is Peter LaBarber with Americans for Truth. Senator Cruz, I'm a big fan. I'd like to ask you questions about the gay agenda. What will you do to reverse and neutralize the Obergefell decision in the Supreme Court, number one? Number two, I assume I know the answer to this question, but what will you do to end Obama's policy of actually flying the rainbow flag at U.S. embassies worldwide? And number three, how can you inject your opposition, which I assume, to the Equality Act, which I'm calling the Homosexual Superiority Act in Congress, which would basically add federal law to this force of these laws which are negating religious freedom across the country?
Well, Peter, thank you for your words of encouragement, and thank you for that question. If you look at the decision from the Supreme Court, the gay marriage decision, it is one of the greatest threats to our democracy we have seen in modern times. It is a decision reminiscent of Roe versus Wade, of a handful of unelected judges arrogantly and lawlessly decreeing the authority to fundamentally change our country and to tear down the foundations of the country. And I agree very much with Justice Scalia, who in dissent said the decision was a fundamental threat to our democracy. It was 5 unelected lawyers declaring themselves the rulers of 320 million Americans. I would also note that the response to that decision is one of the key distinctions in this election. Democrats celebrated that lawless decision, but sadly an awful lot of Republicans did as well. An awful lot of Republicans, including several Republicans who are running for president on the Republican side, said in response to that decision, it is the settled law of the land, we accept it, we surrender, we move on, we will not stand and fight to defend marriage. Those are, word for word, the talking points of Barack Obama. That is fundamentally wrong. I disagree passionately. My response to this decision was that it was illegitimate, it was lawless, it was utterly contrary to the Constitution, and that we should fight to defend marriage on every front. Your question was, what can we do about it? I've introduced a constitutional amendment in the Senate to restore the authority of the state legislatures. Marriage as the union of one man and one woman. I've also introduced legislation in the Senate to strip the federal courts of jurisdiction over challenges to marriage. That is one of the explicit checks and balances given to Congress to rein in an out-of-control judiciary. Beyond that, in the wake of the gay marriage decision, I called for a constitutional amendment to subject Supreme Court justices to periodic retention elections. If they are going to behave like politicians imposing their own policies, then they should be subject to accountability to the electorate. And I would note a number of states, including, for example, Iowa, just recently recalled 3 justices, state justices, who did the same thing, attempted to tear down the marriage laws But here is the sad admission. Right now, we do not have anywhere close to the votes in the United States Congress to pass any of those proposals that I put forward. The Democrats uniformly oppose them, uniformly refuse to defend marriage, and the Republicans, a great many Republicans, including, as I said, several who are running for president, including several who describe themselves as conservatives, have said the marriage decision is the settled law of the land and they will not fight it. I am not willing to concede this fight, and I can tell you two very specific things that I have said. Number one is that as president, I will defend religious liberty. We will not use the federal government to enforce this lawless decision that is a usurpation of the authority of we the people in this country. But number two, that the next president will appoint in all likelihood 1, 2, 3, or 4 Supreme Court justices. The clearest and quickest way to reverse this lawless decision is appointing justices who will be faithful to the Constitution and faithful to the laws of the United States. And I give you my solemn word that every justice I appoint to the Supreme Court will be a justice who will demonstrate fidelity to the Constitution, to the laws of this country, who will not legislate from the bench. Now, every Republican says that when they're campaigning. The difference is I am the only candidate running who has spent decades fighting against judicial activism and who will be willing to spend the political capital necessary to nominate and confirm proven, demonstrated judicial conservatives who will be faithful to the Constitution.
And you've worked in the Supreme Court, of course, as clerk for the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, so you know something about how the institution works. Senator, let me just ask you to follow up. What about the military? Because as you know, the military is beset with these new LGBT rules.
Yes.
And I'm just hearing terrible things. How would you as Commander-in-Chief address that?
Well, you look at the military, one of the things we've seen, and it is morale in the military under the Obama administration is plummeted. And it is plummeted because you have a commander-in-chief that doesn't support our soldiers and sailors and airmen and Marines. You have a commander-in-chief that doesn't stand up against our enemies, that won't even acknowledge or say the words radical Islamic terrorism. And you have a commander-in-chief that treats the military as a cauldron for social experimentation. He's more interested in promoting homosexuality in the military than he is in defeating our enemy. So, for example, the military is now focused on trying to promote transgendered soldiers. The role of the military is not to be some left-wing social experiment. The reason we have the brave men and women who sign up as servicemen and women to defend this nation is to stand for our values, to protect our safety and security, to protect innocent men and women, and to stand up and defeat our enemies. And I would stop the shameless politicizing of our military to push a left-wing agenda that is contrary to the values and contrary to who we are as an American people and a nation founded on Judeo-Christian values.
Bill, let's go to one more caller. One more question.
Go ahead, Gary.
Hi, this is Gary Porter, Yorktown, Virginia, and I want to assure you, Senator, this is not a gotcha question. I greatly admire your positions on all of the policy that you've taken and your willingness to keep the Constitution in our national dialogue. But I know there are conservatives who would be reluctant to vote for you should you become the nominee because they hold to Emmerich Vattel's definition of natural-born citizen. I've never heard you address this issue. Could you do that?
Certainly, I'm very happy to. So the facts of my birth are straightforward and clear, which is my mother was born in Wilmington, Delaware. She was a citizen by birth. When I was born in Calgary in Canada. Under U.S. law, starting from the definitions promulgated by the very first Congress, members of Congress among whom were the framers, U.S. law has defined the child of a U.S. citizen born abroad as a natural-born citizen. Under U.S. law, I am an American citizen by virtue of my birth. I've never breathed a breath of air on this planet when I was not an American citizen. I've never been naturalized. It is the process of being born to my mother that made me an American citizen. As a legal matter, the question is quite straightforward, that the child of a U.S. citizen born abroad qualifies as a natural-born citizen. Indeed, it has come up several times in our nation's history. So, for example, John McCain was born in Panama, but his parents were U.S. citizens, so he was a natural-born citizen by virtue of his parents. Likewise, George Romney, who is Mitt's father, who ran for president in 1968, George Romney was born in Mexico when his parents were Mormon missionaries. And yet George Romney was a natural-born citizen by his parents' citizenship. The third example is kind of interesting. It's Barry Goldwater. Goldwater was born in Arizona, but it was before Arizona was a state. And he was a natural-born citizen because his parents were citizens. For someone wanting to examine the legal question, there was an article written in the Harvard Law Review about 7-8 months ago by Paul Clement, who was George W. Bush's Solicitor General, and Neil Katyal, who was Barack Obama's acting Solicitor General. They wrote the article together. Both of them said, we're not supporting Ted Cruz for president, but as a legal matter, the constitutional question is abundantly plain that the child of a U.S. citizen born abroad qualifies as a natural-born citizen. Now, the question you raised was about Vattel. For those who don't study this, Vattel was a European law commentator, and for some reason that for the life of me I cannot figure out, some conservatives have convinced themselves that Vattel is binding on the U.S. Constitution. He was a foreign law commentator, and international law has no impact on U.S. law. Yes, Vattel was a European law commentator who had different views on what a natural-born citizen was. And frankly, I do not care what a European law commentator thinks about a natural-born citizenship. What I care about is the text of the Constitution. I could care about the understanding of the framers, and I care about the laws that they passed in the very first immigration law passed by the very first Congress explicitly defined a natural-born citizen. And so for folks of good conscience who focus on Vattel, they are under the misimpression that the views of a European law commentator are somehow binding on American law. Will this be an issue that is brought up for some political mischief during the campaign? Sure. That's the nature of politics. But at least as a legal and constitutional matter, the question is quite straightforward, that if you or I or any of us travel abroad, if we have a child abroad, that child is a natural-born citizen by virtue of our being American citizens. And so the constitutional question is quite clear.
And Senator, anything else would be preposterous. I mean, the notion that you'd go abroad and have a child, you couldn't bring the child back, or there would be some issue that the child's now not an American citizen. I mean, that's preposterous.
Well, and I would note, Bishop, it would also mean that our soldiers who are serving abroad, that their children are all, because they are fighting to defend this nation, their children are all ineligible to be president, which is a fairly ludicrous interpretation, and that's why that is not, in fact, what the law says.
Senator, just before you go, you and I have had some discussion about the problems that are happening in the inner cities across this country, the spikes in murders, the gang warfare, the drug addiction, the lack of economic opportunity. And I know you have some thoughts about how we can address that problem, not with more government spending, but with some sort of private sector intervention under the leadership of a president who understands what it takes for an economy to grow.
Right. Well, you're exactly right. And if we look at the conditions of the inner cities, we see the fruits of 5 decades of failed liberal agendas. Just about every large city in this country has been under the exclusive control of the Democrats for decades. And during that time, we have seen the devastation of these failed policies. You know, if you look back in the 1950s, in the 1950s, Detroit was a city of 2 million people. It was the wealthiest city per capita in the country. It was the Silicon Valley of its time. And yet, Democrats have controlled Detroit for 5 decades. Their policies have devastated that city. Crime has proliferated. Dependency on government has proliferated. Marriages have been shattered, broken apart. We've seen the family shattered and broken apart. Detroit now has roughly 700,000 citizens. It is less than half the size was in the 1950s, the damage these policies have wreaked, and they have wreaked in particular in the African American community and the Hispanic community. Minority communities have been damaged the most by failed big government policies. You look at policies that promote dependency. You're not doing anyone a favor by making them dependent on government. Instead, I am very much a Frederick Douglass Republican. I am very much someone who believes that the way someone rises the economic ladder, the way someone achieves the American dream, is to stand on their own feet. You know, for me, I think about my father, who came to America 58 years ago. When he came to Cuba, he couldn't speak English. He was a teenage immigrant who had $100 in his underwear and who washed dishes making 50 cents an hour. And I've said many times, thank God, some well-meaning liberal didn't come put his arm around my father and say, let me take care of you. Let me make you dependent on government. Let me sap your self-respect and your dignity. And by the way, don't bother learning English. I respect your culture so much, I'm going to lock you out of the professional and educated classes in this country. That would have been utterly destructive. We need a new agenda of hope and freedom and opportunity for the inner cities, for minority communities. You know, I chaired several weeks ago a hearing in the Senate on the effect of overregulation in the minority communities, how African Americans and Hispanics are not able to get jobs or trapped out of economic mobility because of the crushing regulations of big government that are locking them out. We need instead an agenda of empowerment where small businesses are growing, where people have opportunities to get skills, to climb the economic ladder, to achieve a better life. And let me mention two other things that I think are tremendously important for the inner city and for minority communities. The first is law enforcement and keeping us safe. You look at the Black Lives Matter movement. Unfortunately, President Obama and the Attorney General have done an enormous amount of damage by vilifying and demonizing police officers and law enforcement that keep our communities safe. It is fundamentally wrong for the President and the Attorney General to target and demonize police officers who risk their lives every day, and the consequence of that demonization is that cops have withdrawn, they're unable to do their job, and we're seeing crime rates spike in big cities across this country. We're seeing murder rates spike in big cities across the country. You look at the city of Baltimore, following the protests that occurred there, following the demonization of the police that occurred there, the month of July was the bloodiest month in Baltimore history since the 1970s. 45 people were murdered in Baltimore in the month of July. And of those 45, 43 of them were African American. You want to talk about Black Lives Matter? That's 43 black lives that were lost because the police were not able to do their job and protect the innocent citizens who live there. And it is not doing minority communities a favor to have the police withdraw and fail to protect the women and children and families that want to live in peace and raise their kids. And a final point I'll make, I believe school choice is the civil rights issue of the 21st century. That for far too long, the left has been content to leave generations of kids trapped in failing schools, trapped with education is the key to economic opportunity, to economic mobility, to achieving a better life and future for your family. And we have never once had a Republican president who gets school choice in his gut, in his heart, and who is prepared to fight for every child in America, regardless of race, ethnicity, wealth, or zip code. Every child in America has a right to access a quality education. And I intend in this election to campaign and to make that case, particularly for the kids who the Democratic control of the education establishment has been failing, that we will fight to extend school choice to empower every parent and every child to be able to choose an excellent education. And that is an agenda that will transform the inner cities and help people stand on their own feet to lift themselves out of poverty and into a better life and into the American dream.
Senator, you are the only candidate that's taken time to be with us. These are leaders across the country. I'm sure they appreciate the time you've taken. You're the only candidate who has spoken to the issues of the inner city in the way that you have. I really want to thank you for the time that you've given us. I think we are well served by having you as a candidate for president.
Well, thank you, Bishop Jackson. Jackson, thank you for your friendship and your tremendous principled leadership, and I want to thank each of you all for being on this call and for your leadership in your communities. I would ask each of you for your support. Our website is tedcruz.org. We are building a grassroots army across this country of men and women who want to change the path we're on and want to get back to the free market principles and constitutional liberties that built this country up. And so I ask each of you to join us. Come to the website, tedcruz.org. Be part of the army that's coming together. And if it comes from the people, from we the people, that's how we're going to turn the country around. And I'm grateful for each of your leadership and passion and commitment to freedom, to the Constitution, and to this great nation. Thank you very much.
All right. Safe travel, Senator. God bless you.
God bless you.